actually kind of along the same theme. So if you came to the Lenten Thursday discussion that I led a couple of weeks ago, you are already clued in on the little secret that I revealed to all of our Hilton brothers and sisters that night. If you weren't there, you should know that that night I revealed to all of those present that I have a wee bit of an obsession with something. One that I have had since I was quite young. I adore the Golden Girls. Those 4 independent, sassy, speak-their-mind women who spent their retirement age years together in a house in Miami during the late 80s and early 90s. Now, everyone has a favorite golden gal for vast and various reasons. And for a while, mine was always Sophia, acerbic, unabashedly afraid to say what she thought, always quick with a quip, Sophia. But as I return to the show more and more, I find that my heart grows for Rose. Sweet Minnesotan Betty White playing, never wanting to harm anyone's feelings, Rose. But it's not just her St. Olaf stories or her naivete that draws me to her. It's her complete lack of fear when it comes to asking questions. No matter how much she knows that one of the girls might lash out at her for asking a simple question, she never hesitates. She is uncertain about something. She wants clarity on a situation. She doesn't understand what's going on. She just asks openly and honestly without fear of what might come after, even when what comes after is sometimes a newspaper to the head. They weren't very nice to Rose with her questions sometimes. That also kind of bugs me. But anyway, Dorothy is nervous before her son comes to visit with his yet-to-be-introduced to the family fiancé and admits to those nerves. Now, everyone in the room knows why she just said she's nervous, and yet Rose quietly pipes up from the table, "Are you nervous because you haven't met Michael's fiancé yet?" Stating the obvious, just so she can be sure that she knows what's going on. In another episode, she and Blanche are in a bit of a heated back and forth with a new friend of Dorothy's, a writer who clearly thinks that Blanche and Rose aren't smart enough for the conversation and makes some quip about a metaphor, and then says what a metaphor is. Blanche bitingly says in the midst of that conversation, "I know what a metaphor is, dear." And Rose innocently just sits there and goes, "Blanche, what's a metaphor?" Completely proving this person's point. But she's unafraid of the consequences, just wanting to make sure she's got it all figured out. No matter the situation, Rose will be there to make sure that she gets it, even if it makes her look foolish. Well, this morning, folks, on the second Sunday of Easter, our lectionary once again serves up the same story we get every first Sunday after Easter. The story that history has branded as Jesus and doubting Thomas. Well, today I would like to reclaim that brand and change it around. Today I would like us to think of this gospel as Jesus and Thomas, the Rose Nyland of the disciples. I will be completely honest and say that as much as my Rose Nyland love has grown over the years, my Thomas love has grown in a similar way. It's turned into an appreciation for who he is and what he brings to the table, while at the same time I have grown more and more frustrated with the hand history and theology have dealt Thomas, with the legacy they have laid at his feet as the example of what we are not to do in the face of faith struggles and uncertainties. He is the example of doubt in the face of the many questions of faith. For so long, we have been told that we need to be less like Thomas, just as many would say that you shouldn't be like Rose, naive and unassuming. But today, well, I would argue that we need to give Thomas a break and see where maybe some of us could use the okay to embrace our Thomas side a little bit more. Put yourselves in Thomas's shoes this morning. The disciples have been locked up in this room for days. They continue to be mired in the weight and the grief of the events of Holy Week. Certain things are glaringly obvious and make the atmosphere of the room oppressive. There in the corner sits Peter, probably still berating himself over his denials of his friendship with Jesus. He's probably heartsick and moody, lashing out at one turn and beating himself up at another while fighting back tears. There are absences amongst them that are too stark to ignore. Jesus is no longer there. Their friend, their teacher, has left along with their hope. Judas, one of their friends, their companions for 3 years, now guilty of being the one that handed Jesus over. The Romans and the Jewish authorities still are stalking the streets, potentially looking for them, seeking to quash the Jesus fervor as ardently as possible. This room is thick with fear and grief and loss. And for some reason, Thomas leaves this room. We don't know if he simply can't take it anymore, the weight of it, if he just needs to get out of this room and breathe and process on his own, or if he maybe just drew the short stick and is the one that has to go out for groceries that day. Whatever the reason, Thomas is not there when the atmosphere in the room completely changes because Jesus shows up. The rest of the disciples get the gift of being present for this miraculous appearance of the resurrected Jesus. The rest of the disciples get the gift of Jesus' immediate peace, the gift of the Holy Spirit breathed upon them, the gift of Jesus offering up his hands and his side to show them it is in fact him. By the time Thomas gets back, it's over. The room he returns to isn't the same. He walks in this room that was once coated in fear is now lighter, happier. And all he gets is the message that Jesus was here. Imagine the letdown. Imagine the fear. Imagine the questions. What truly happened? Are his friends just hallucinating? Had they finally lost it? Has the grief finally got to them? How could I have missed it? Why couldn't Jesus have found me too? Why couldn't I have been here? How can I trust this if I haven't seen it? Without fail, in situations such as these, Thomas is always the one willing to ask the tough questions. On Maundy Thursday, after Jesus told the disciples that he was going to prepare a place for them and that they knew the way to where he was going, Thomas was the only one willing to speak up and say, Jesus, we don't know where you are going. How can we know the way? Thomas is the one that Jesus looks at and says, I am the way and the truth and the life. Thomas is consistently the disciple willing to give voice to the not always kosher questions or statements. And yes, this morning he demands proof, but he is also simply demanding to be included in what the others received. If we were in Thomas's shoes, would we have done any different? If any of the other disciples had been in his shoes, wouldn't they too have wanted the same treatment, the same assurance that the resurrection was real? For centuries, Thomas's demands in this story have labeled him as an example not to live by. The church has told people, do not be like doubting Thomas. Be among those who have not seen but can simply believe. And maybe that's the message we need, because we are a people asked to believe what we have not tangibly seen and touched. Yet at the same time, this message has led to an overwhelming, overpowering message that doubt, that questions are bad, that they are signs of a poorer, lesser faith. We have labeled Thomas as a doubter and said to not be like him, and thus created a theology, a faith that isn't big enough to hold our questions and our doubts. We have created a faith that doesn't seem to welcome those things, and we have looked at people who have approached the altar with doubt in their hearts and said that they are just like Thomas, and we look at them with pity and sadness. We have created a faith that doesn't hold our Thomas moments as sacred and real, but as things that are to be quieted and shoved into a corner. And then we wonder why some people have lost patience with the church, have lost faith that it is a place where they can be held and treasured. We have created an anti-Thomas world where questions and doubts are bad and shouldn't be voiced, because what would God think? What would the church think? But here's the thing. Did Jesus love Thomas any less for asking the question? Did Jesus not also extend his hands and his side to Thomas and tell him to look? Did Jesus not once again give him his peace? In all of those moments of Thomas's life when he asked questions, did he become less of a disciple, less faithful because he gave voice to the things that plagued his heart? No, 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 No. Imagine who Thomas would have been had he not asked those questions. Imagine what his faith might have looked like had he kept quiet, tamped them down, huddled in a corner and said, no, I can't ask that. I might get in trouble. They might think differently. Jesus might kick me out of this group. I can't imagine he would have been the same man. I love Thomas because he gives us permission to ask questions and because he reminds us that sometimes doubt is part of the journey. It doesn't make you less than. It doesn't make you unworthy. It doesn't make you anything less than human and real and a disciple. God is big enough to shoulder our questions and our doubts and our moments of faltering. Jesus is right there in those moments with a hand extended to show us love and the grace to say, ask away, I can handle it. There is nothing wrong with you or your faith in those moments, just as there was nothing wrong with Thomas in this one single moment of a large life of faith. This morning, we are reclaiming a theology of faith that doesn't brand Thomas as unworthy of discipleship because he dared to give voice to thoughts that we have all probably had, but instead says, thank God, our God is big enough to handle our struggles and our questions. The promise of this season, the promise of the resurrection is that God is always making something new, and sometimes that something is our faith. Maybe you're sitting here this morning and you just aren't sure. Maybe you're sitting here scared that you might be the only one with questions. Maybe you are striving to get back to that feeling of last week when the resurrection felt so tangible and real. Maybe you are afraid that you're the only one fearing. You aren't. And if you are, it's okay. Doubt and questions, they're part of the journey, and it's a journey we're on together, not to shove those struggling into the corner or in the dark and say, deal with it on your own, but to say, we've been there too, and God is still here. Ask your questions, voice your doubts, name your struggle, because in the end, God will bury them in an empty tomb and bring them out of the darkness to a new dawn. It's okay to feel like Thomas. It is okay to be a Rose Nyland in a world made for Sophia Petrillos. Ask your questions. I promise God can handle it. Amen.